Next chapter, classification. This is planet Earth, the home to diverse forms of life. Animals, plants, fungi, microorganisms, and much more. 30 million species inhabit the biosphere, ranging from microscopic bacteria to giant mammals like blue whales. Organisms differ in form, structure, and mode of living, so we need to group them together according to their similarities in order to study them. This will help us trace and understand their relationships and identify them. This is called classification. And so, classification is a field of biology that deals with the grouping of organisms according to their structures. In terms of biological classifications, organisms are classified or grouped together with other organisms that are most closely related to. The closest organisms are those that can freely and naturally breed to produce fertile or viable offspring. These small groups are then classified into larger groups. While doing classification, we also factor in the evolutionary relationship of organisms because, as we shall later see, all organisms have a common origin. The science of classification is called taxonomy. Biologists who study taxonomy are called taxonomists, and the small groups or units of classification are called taxa. In the 4th century, the Greek philosopher Aristotle classified animals based on whether they live on earth, in water, or in the air. However, this kind of classification was very unscientific because obviously it placed unrelated organisms like fish, crocodiles, and whales living in water in the same group. Over the years, scientists have tried to classify organisms into broad categories called kingdoms. Carolus Linnaeus classified all living organisms as plantae and animalia. Ernst Haeckel proposed Protista to include eukaryotic unicellular organisms. Copeland introduced Monera to include all prokaryotic organisms. In 1962, Robert Whittaker proposed Mycota to include the fungi. This led to the 5-kingdom classification, which we use today. In this classification, organisms are divided on the basis of characteristics into groups and subgroups. In the classification scheme, a hierarchy of groups is identified and proceeds from the highest and the largest, that is kingdom, to the lowest and smallest, the species. So we have 7 major taxonomic units. Let's look at the 5 kingdoms. The kingdom Monera includes prokaryotic cells which lack organized nucleus and organelles with membranes. Common members of Monera include bacteria, blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, and mycoplasma. Members of kingdom Protista are algae, diatoms, and protozoans. Their mode of nutrition can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. They are single-celled and the simplest forms of eukaryotes. Some move with whip-like flagella, hair-like cilia, or finger-like pseudopodia. The kingdom fungi include mushrooms, rhizopas, and muca. These organisms are not plants and do not perform photosynthesis. Most are multicellular and eukaryotic. Fungi derive food from dead decaying materials and are called saprophytes. Some live in a mutual relationship with blue-green algae. Together, blue-green algae and the fungi are called lichen, and the relationship is called symbiosis. The kingdom Plantae include all plants that are non-mobile and are autotrophic. They are multicellular and eukaryotic with cell walls made of cellulose. Kingdom Animalia is the largest and most advanced kingdom in terms of diversity and complexity of organisms. It includes all motile animals and heterotrophic. They are multicellular and eukaryotic without cell walls. Each kingdom is divided into smaller units called phyla for animals or divisions for plants. The phyla is divided into class, class into order, order into family, family is divided into genera, and genera is divided into species. As you go down the hierarchy, the members of each taxonomic unit get closer and closer in terms of resemblance, and therefore you will see that their numbers reduce as you go down the group. And so the species is the basic unit of classification, and whose members can freely and naturally interbreed to produce a fertile offspring. Now we move to the scientific naming of organisms. Now, another important landmark in the history of classification of living organisms was the development of a system of scientific naming or nomenclature introduced by Carolus Linnaeus. When we name an organism, we write the genus name first and the species name second. Both names are in Latin. This naming system, where two names are allocated, is called the binomial nomenclature. The binomial nomenclature is governed by a set of rules. The genus name is written first, followed by the species name, and the two names are separate. The genus name begins with a capital letter, while the species name begins with a small letter. When printed, the scientific name is italicized. When handwritten, the names are underlined separately. And so, the closest relatives of a particular species are those that share the same generic name. And still, we see some small differences amongst members of a particular species, like skin color in humans. This is what we call varieties in plants and races in humans. For example, all the domestic dogs belong to the same species called Canis familiaris. Other members of the dog family that are closely related but not of the same species will share a higher group name, genus, but with a different species name. For example, the gray wolf, which is the closest relative to the domestic dog, is classified as Canis lupus. And so, in summary, classification of living organisms proceeds from the highest taxon, kingdom, to the lowest taxon, the species. We can make a simple acronym to remember this, like keep ponds clean or frogs get sick. This classification of living things is important for a number of reasons. 1. It brings together living organisms with similar features and separates those that have different features. By grouping organisms, we can develop diagrams that show the interrelatedness of organisms based on their morphological diversity. For example, this diagram of taxonomic tree shows that humans are more closely related to chimpanzees than they are to gorillas. A common ancestor is represented by each branch of the taxonomic tree. It can show how long ago humans and gorillas diverged from an evolutionary perspective. Finally, recent advancement in science, including the ability to categorize DNA sequences, have enabled scientists to accurately determine how closely species are related to each other. This has led to constant review of classification. New organisms are continually being discovered, and relationships between organisms are changing all the time. So the importance of taxonomic study to modern science cannot be underestimated.